Thank you, Mark, for that very generous introduction. I really appreciate you including me in this program today. I've learned a lot myself already today, and hopefully some of the connections between the earlier talks will be apparent as I go through my argument. The work that I'm presenting on today builds on the argument and the thesis that I present in Archaeologies of Touch. If you're interested in picking up a copy, there are flyers downstairs. We have a special 30% off promo code, especially for this conference. In the book, I provide a material history of touch technologies that situates the emergence of haptic human-computer interfaces in the context of a broader technoscientific transformation of touch. As implied by the title, I approach the subject using a media archaeological lens and method, which essentially means that I'm interested in opening up productive connections between the past, present, and future of media technologies. So I'm concerned not just with the technical features of the touch machines that I explore, but also with how these technical features express the themes of bodily discipline, management, and fragmentation under industrial and post-industrial capitalism, and also serve to encode hegemonic and normative models of the senses at the material level. And you'll see some of that orientation play out in what I present today. But to start, just what do we mean by haptic interface? And we've gotten a little bit of an introduction to this already today, but I thought I'd just start us off with a video of the Tesla suit.
Wow, that is amazing.
Tesla suit is a full-body haptic suit that lets you touch and feel sensations in virtual reality.
Whoa. That's awesome. That was amazing. It's awesome.
Stimulating.
Massive potential. Everything changed.
Incredible. I really enjoyed it.
This is the real deal. This is not some fictional prototype.
This is definitely the future.
You guys have nailed it.
This is worth developing for.
The potential of the Tesla suit is enormous.
The promise of the technology on display in this video obviously looks immense. It offers to rematerialize the dematerialized virtual world in powerful and transformative ways, implicating the body directly in computer-generated environments that have, up until now, acted on our senses primarily through images and sounds. Quote, "Feel what you play," as the company's tagline puts it. That's all well and good in general, but let's get specific. How does the Tesla suit accomplish this goal of making its wearer feel fully embodied in the virtual world? The suit merges three different systems together. The first, a network of 46, quote, haptic points distributed around the suit, allows it to create realistic sensations by triggering the body at each of these distinct points, producing feelings of weight and pressure, using a combination of vibration stimulation and electrical stimulation to induce the perception of haptic illusions. Second, the suit employs a climate control system distributed at 10 points around the body, 4 on the torso, 2 on the arms, and 2 on the legs, to strategically heat up or cool down the wearer. Finally, the Tesla suit's 14-point motion capture system allows the user's body to be projected accurately into the three-dimensional space of the virtual world. Working in conjunction, these three systems purportedly cement a link between the haptic system of the avatar in the computer-generated environment and the haptic system of whoever dons the Tesla suit. Successfully implemented, the suit would fulfill the categorical promise mobilized around haptic interfaces since they were dreamt up in the 1960s by American computing pioneer Ivan Sutherland, to allow objects in computer-generated environments to feel as real as they would in the physical world. Sutherland's vision of, quote, an ultimate display laid the blueprint for a haptic feedback system so robust that it could assume full and violent control over the user's body. As he explains, the ultimate display would, of course, be a room within which the computer can control the existence of matter. A chair displayed in such a room would be good enough to sit in. Handcuffs displayed in such a room would be confining, and a bullet displayed in such a room would be fatal. And although this Tesla suit obviously stopped short of realizing the painful and destructive capacity of Sutherland's system, it nevertheless exemplifies the imagined aim of haptic interfaces, right? This goal of full embodiment in a computer-generated simulation so realistic that it would allow a bullet to kill your body. Okay, so now that the Tesla suit has provided us with an image of what a haptic interface is, let's pull back to think about what's at stake in the project of virtualizing worlds. I want to suggest here today that the point of interfacing between the human and machine, involves a reciprocal construction of touch and technology, one where touch helps to define the object it interfaces with, but is also itself transformed through this process of interfacing. This diagram of human-computer haptics from a 1997 article by the pioneering interface designer Madhyam Srinivasan illustrates the relationship between touch and technology that I'm arguing for here. The diagram positions the human hand and the computer-controlled robot arm it comes into contact with as symmetrical technical systems, each governed by discernible laws of energy transfer, each possessing mechanisms that allow it to move through space and sense its position as it does so, with each feeding data into a processing and control module. So the computer on one side and the human on the other. What we see in the system is a symmetrical arrangement of human and machine, with the analogous sensory motor systems operating in both meeting at the point of interface to construct a haptic impression of the virtual object, rendered through a single point of contact between user and virtual environment. Successfully realizing the system, however, requires research not just into the proper construction of the machine's component subsystems. So here we see motion, position information, sensors, the computer processor, torque commands, and actuators, but it also requires new research on each of the subsystems of the human as well. So contact forces, sensors, tactile and kinesthetic information, the neurophysiology and neuropsychology of haptic perception, and so on. In other words, touch's McLuhan-esque extension into virtual worlds does not simply involve its extension, but also its transformation. In order for it to be extended, touch has to become an object of techno-scientific laboratory research aimed at laying bare its constitutive parts. The project of designing haptic interfaces is a project of rebuilding or re-engineering or reformatting touch itself. Here we can use McLuhan, again, not to define media, but to define interface, which he frames as, and this is a really beautiful definition, he takes it from chemistry, quote, the interaction of substances in a kind of mutual irritation, end quote. The point of contact between human and machine forces a reconfiguration of the machine, and the machine prompts a reorganization of the human. Okay, so, do me a favor and bookmark this image in your head for a minute because I'm going to come back to it again later. But for now, I want to pull back one more step and question the very possibility of virtualizing touch, which I'll do by examining a rather lengthy passage from Derrida's 2005 book on touching. And I apologize here for throwing this. This is not a thing I like to do in talks, for throwing this wall of text at you. But I thought it was really important to understand Derrida's framing. It's going to help set up the rest of my talk. Derrida makes three important moves here. First, with the assertion that, quote, one spontaneously has the tendency to believe that touching resists virtualization. He sets up the purported irreducibility and materiality of touch as a countervailing force against the reducibility and immateriality of vision. Touch is supposedly superior to vision precisely because it remains the guarantor of authenticity. And I'm going to come back to this quote in a second. The communication theorist and historian John Durham Peters is one adherent to what Derrida describes as the position of, quote, haptocentric intuitionism. In his 1999 book, Speaking into the Air, he makes a series of related claims about touch's irreducibility to capture by technical media. Touch defies inscription, remains stubbornly wed to the proximate, it has no remote capacity, and also it resists being made into a medium of recording and transmission. Haptic interfaces, according to the haptocentric intuitionists, are impossible machines, precisely because touch's inherent properties make it resistant to those mediation techniques that have worked so successfully to virtualize the senses of seeing and hearing. Touch then finds itself in a curious situation. It is simultaneously empowered as the final guarantor of the real and authentic, while at the same time being disempowered because of its structural characteristics, which forbid it from entering virtual worlds. From a sensory standpoint, the epistemology of the virtual can be visual and oral, but it cannot, according to the haptocentric intuitionists, be tactile. Derrida, however, rebuffs the intuitionist claims about touch's fundamental and inherent countermediality by rhetorically asking the question, who are we to believe that touch cannot be virtualized? A tacit suggestion that touch can, in fact, have the same discrete calculability as the senses of seeing and hearing. In the passage's final move, Derrida asserts that the recent attempts to virtualize touch, and which were at the time very recent, if we recall that the book was first published in French in the year 2000, these recent attempts constitute something like an origin of techniques. The passage sets up Derrida's brief exploration of applications of haptical technologies, primarily in the area of museum display. And curiously, in the context of this talk, Derrida directly references the interface depicted in Srinivasan's diagram of an end effector system, along with the range of research areas involved in what Srinivasan termed, quote, the new discipline of computer haptics. And this is an early model of the phantom haptic interface that Mark discussed earlier, that he writes about in his article on the remote handshake. Foremost among these research areas that Derrida talked about are the, quote, algorithms of immediate contact that govern the operation of haptic devices, a phrase suggesting that the physical contact between humans and bodies can be reduced to a calculable set of operations. Derrida is not nostalgic about the possibility of transformation. He does not indulge in the sort of naive moral panic that we see so frequently mobilized in response to digital touch technologies. Rather, he concludes by suggesting that, quote, tomorrow's Sigmund Freud will have to refine his magic writing pad and the topography of bodies during psychoanalytical sessions, not to mention erogenous, distance-touching, and amorous bodies wrestling in the sheets of the internet's web. So, peak Derrida, right? Remember that phrase, amorous bodies wrestling in the sheets of the internet's web, right? Derrida is sort of anticipating and maybe even reacting to teledildonics there, which we'll discuss again in a second. I want to use Derrida's prompt to move in two directions. One, looking back at the origin of techniques he identifies, the other looking forward at the attempts to overcome touch's purported resistance to virtualization. First, to the origin of techniques. Derrida was quite right, I think, in spirit to suggest that there is an origin of techniques at work in the design of haptic interfaces. But if we take Srinivasan's map, our diagram as a map of all the research areas associated with human haptic computer interfacing, then the origin of techniques lies not in the late 20th century search for new machines to stimulate touch, but rather it extends back much further. It recalls, for example, 18th century electrical experiments when electrical machines were designed intentionally to produce shocks that would be both instructive, that is to say epistemic, and amusing, or that is to say aesthetically pleasing. Jean Nollet's famous public demonstrations, where he used a Leyden jar to pass an electrical charge through French monks and soldiers, were intended on the one hand to multiply witnesses to the scientific fact that electricity passed instantly between connected bodies, and on the other hand to provide an amusing form of electrotactile stimulation to the experimental participants. Similarly, electrotherapy machines developed in the 18th century to treat a whole range of maladies served as teaching tools as well as medical devices, providing an embodied tactile illustration of the path that electricity took as it passed through the body. And these machines, if you go back and look at the early training manuals for electrotherapy, these are from, I think, 1887. they had an electrode for every part of the body. So an eye electrode, the new style rectal electrode, which I assume is better than the old style rectal electrode, I hope. The double uterine electrode, so electricity was also used to induce abortions in the late 19th century, and the tonsil stimulator. And these are, as you can see here, only 4 of hundreds contained in this training manual. Here we see the path that electricity takes as it passes through the body during therapy sessions. And these were really used as an embodied metaphor for the way that information moved through electrical telegraphy systems in the late 19th century. By the early 1900s, as its use for medicine was declining, electricity became a popular feature in arcade machines, used to energize, revitalize, and beautify depleted urban bodies, as we see in this American shock machine, which implores customers to, quote, take a shock and look pleasant. And if you sort of read the text, it says, for one night jags, right? So the idea here is you're tired, you've had a long day, you're going out, you go and you put a nickel in the machine, you grab onto the handles, it passes electricity through you, and you are no longer tired. Sort of wish I had one of those today. The shocks produced by these arcade machines were later employed as game mechanics, providing a way for players to receive the curative effects of electricity. We've gone dark. The electricity has run out. This is... It's way better with the video, I promise. It is literally how appropriate. We have a lack of electricity.
I didn't reconnect it after the switch.
Okay. And we're back. I think so. We're not.
Is this the way?
No, it should be. Okay, beautiful. And we're back. So these shocks produced by the arcade machines were used as game mechanics, which provided a way for players to receive the curative effects of electricity while also testing their endurance and fortitude. And I wanted to show you this video because I just kind of love it and take any excuse I can to show it. This is a game called Spear the Dragon. And the goal, as you might guess, is to spear the dragon. As the spear gets closer to the dragon, the electrical current intensifies. And that's why I love this guy, because right after that, the next thing he thinks to do is to do it again. I think he's had enough. This origin of techniques also includes 19th century psychophysical experiments on touch by Ernst Heinrich Weber, intended to lay bare the underlying structures of haptic perception. Weber's exhaustive body of experiments, often carried out on himself, produced a detailed map of touch's sensitivity across the whole range of the skin. And these are actually really simple experiments that you can just do with a little mathematical compass. Can you perceive the 2 points of contact as distinct from one another? If you can, move them closer together until they disappear and measure that just notice difference, right? Quantify that just notice difference. So here's one of Weber's maps. And then later on, what's really interesting here, and maybe he's going to set up the discussion of teledildonics in a minute, is that Weber doesn't map the genitals, doesn't perform this experiment on the genitals, and later on, this same battery of experiments was performed again in the 20th century. In fact, if you were going to school for psychology in the early 20th century, one of the things that you did was repeat the 2-point threshold experiments. Try to see if you could repeat Weber's results, verify his results, or challenge them. Right? So here we see a more refined map. Equally as important as these experiments were in isolation, they also laid the groundwork for a new materialist approach to studying touch, eventually dubbed haptics by the Berlin physiologist Max Sessoir, and defined as, quote, the doctrine of touch with concomitant sensations and perceptions, quote, the quote here is really important, as optics is the doctrine of sight and acoustics that of hearing, right? So there's an analogous formulation of not just touch, but the science of touch or the doctrine of touch to seeing and hearing. The work of haptics involved developing specialized instruments and apparatuses to carve touch up into smaller units for isolation and quantification and measurement. A subdivision of the body that made it intelligible to empirical science. Separate instruments were used to study the perception of pressure, weight, vibration, temperature, and pain, with each mode of sensation considered a distinct psychophysical mechanism. Within the space of the lab, touch was cut apart into pieces, enclosed within an experimental frame that allowed it to be rendered knowable and manageable. And here we see a 19th century subject enclosed precisely within this epistemic frame in order to judge if they could sense multiple points of contact simultaneously. There's obviously much more to this prehistory of haptic computer interfaces that we could talk about, but in the interest of time, I'll jump from the psychology labs of the 19th century to the porn industry design labs of 2007 as a way to illustrate the utility of Weber's subdivision of touch into component parts. The Adult Entertainment Broadcast Network, at the time one of the largest distributors of online pornography, responded to the challenge of piracy by developing a new product intended to curb unauthorized copies of its material. Partnering with an engineer who had previously worked for NASA, AEBN developed a device that could add touch sensations to its videos. And you'll have to bear with me here to suppress either your reflex to giggle or your reflex to feel creeped out. It's giggle-worthy, and it's creepy on many levels, and the real touch is bound up inextricably with questions of gendered embodiment and gendered labor, with problematic ideologies of men's rights of access to female bodies, and with heteronormative coding of sexuality. I discussed these issues at length in my Vice article on the real touch, which is freely available online. But more pertinent to my purpose here today, the real touch embodies the strategic fragmentation of touch crafted in the lab, with its separate mechanisms for coding the sensations produced by sexual content, pressure, temperature, and viscosity. The real touch embodied Weber's subdivision of the senses. And I'm going to skip the video here, just in the interest of time. Apologize. It's really good, really problematic on many, many levels. Along with the audiovisual information present in a conventional video file, the VOD streams, video on demand streams, were encoded with data that controlled the real touch's movements. Video that couldn't be pirated because it streamed exclusively from AEBN's servers in a proprietary format. In 2012, and you can see this is the breakdown of the device. You can see the device's interiority and how it goes about fragmenting the body. In 2012, AEBN added a joystick controller to the system, which it gave away for free to cam workers who agreed in return to participate in the RealTouch interactive network, described by one commentator as the world's first online digital brothel. The joystick allowed cam workers to manipulate the RealTouch and its wearer in real time in hopes that this new form of interaction would increase the appeal of their sessions. A sort of online version of the Midas touch principle, which asserts that restaurant servers and bartenders who touch their customers receive higher rates of tips. The point here is to suggest that the RTI, because it facilitated touch from a distance, would increase the affective and emotional bond between the cam worker and her customer, leading to repeated patronage in a marketplace where the supply of labor far outstripped its demand. In the short version of the story, the RealTouch was discontinued in 2014 due to a patent violation lawsuit. But during its 7-year life, the RealTouch reduced female bodies to a series of numerical codes intended to pleasurably stimulate male bodies, divided up according to an informatic and algorithmic logic that was not new to the age of computing, but rather originated in the experimental psychology labs of the 19th century. Derrida's algorithms of immediate contact here involve rule sets that govern the operation of the device, the way that on-screen action is synchronized with the spinning of the device's belts, the coordination between the heating elements, and the lubricant dispenser. They involve new ways that make, the RealTouch involves new ways that make female and male bodies expressed and experienced through digital technology. And finally, the RealTouch represents one response to the challenge touch presented to computing, a challenge overcome, however problematically and however temporarily, by a process of hyper-masculine capitalist industrial design. I'll just show you one last screenshot. This is the console that, if you were the cam worker manipulating the RealTouch, this is the console that you would have seen. So you don't actually get to, you don't receive any feedback from the male. There's no touch feedback coming back the other way. What you have instead is this visualization of your action on the device, and then the male can click a button on his console to indicate his level of arousal. So this is the only feedback that you get is through this little button right here. So, to frame the practical problems posed by this project of transmitting touch through computer networks, I'll turn now to Michael Abrash, the chief scientist for Oculus Rift. As the new age of VR dawned in 2015, Abrash took the stage at the second annual Oculus Developers Conference to outline the challenges facing designers of virtual reality systems. And here's Abrash. I might cut this video short just in the interest of time. He talks for a little while, but I think it's important to set
Once we
up.
have the ability to drive the senses well enough to produce experiences that feel real, and we can track the real world well enough to bring ourselves and other people into it, we can think about how we want to interact with that virtual world. The feedback loop from vision to motor control to haptic sensation is one of the most powerful ways to create deeply convincing experiences. Oculus Touch is a huge step in that direction, but it's obvious that what we really want in the long run is for the hands to be able to act as the dexterous virtual manipulators that they are in the real world. That's incredibly hard, arguably harder than either driving the senses or reconstructing the real world, for two reasons. The first problem is that there's no hope anytime soon of reproducing the haptics of the real world. There are several obstacles to this, but the showstopper is that there's no feasible way to fully reproduce real-world kinematics. Put another way, when you put your hand down on a virtual table, there's no known or prospective consumer technology that would keep your hand from going right through it. Bringing physical props into the virtual world, mapping a real keyboard into VR, for example, can help. But if all we wanted was the real world, we wouldn't have bothered with VR in the first place. What we really want are virtual keyboards, as well as virtual levers, buttons, handles, and other tools and controls that work as well as their physical equivalents, along with the ability to manipulate a wide range of virtual objects. In order to make that happen, new haptic technology, primarily based on touch, and possibly combined with some localized kinesthetics, needs to be developed, so the hands can sense and respond to virtual interactions. That will certainly be hard, but solving it will only get us to the second challenge, developing a whole new interaction language around that haptic technology. Imagine that it's 1970, and you've just invented the mouse, but still have to invent and implement the concept of a bitmapped windowing interface for the mouse to drive. That's where we'll be when we've developed good enough haptic technology. Figuring that out is going to take a lot of research and time, but I'm absolutely confident that the first haptic VR interface that really works will be world-changing magic on a par with the first mouse-based windowing systems. I wish I had more to tell you.
Okay, world-changing magic, right? This is the framework that Abrash is setting up. But he also says part of the challenge is that we don't have good algorithms of immediate contact, right? We don't have an interaction language for this new system. So with Abrash's framing in place, let's look at a couple more representative examples. And with these examples, I'm interested in identifying how the interface between touch and technology transforms our knowledge about touch while also transforming the type of knowledge gained through the newly virtualized touch. If the virtualization of touch enables a haptic epistemology of computerized environments that can serve as a countervailing force to the hegemony of the visual, then it is important to specify which of touch's multiple modalities gain entry into the virtual world. These final examples are taken from the very near future. The first, the Haptic Glove, I'll just show you the video for that, it's pretty short. I love the music. It's my favorite part of the video. The second example, and I'm just going to play a quick chunk of a much longer video, is one of 3 projects that Microsoft has a haptics research team now, just launched in 2017. They just unveiled these new projects 2 weeks ago, so this is really new, sort of cutting edge experimental research. I'm just going to show you a quick clip from the Haptic Claw, or just, I guess, shortened to the Claw.
Claw enables rich VR interactions in a compact, handheld, free-moving device. With Claw, you can grasp virtual objects and feel appropriate forces during grasping. You can also touch and feel the shape of a virtual object, as well as get resistance when you push on them. You can also rub virtual surfaces and feel their texture rendered underneath your fingertip. Finally, you can also feel the recoil when shooting a virtual weapon. Claw is a unique, multifunctional haptic controller that enables grasping, touching, surface texture rendering, and shooting feedback. By reading the thumb position using a proximity sensor, our controller changes its haptic mode between grasping and touching.
Okay, I'm going to cut them off there just in the interest
We use
of
a
time.
force sensor located.
So which hand gains entry to virtual worlds, right? Which version of touch is it the whole hand, or is it a strategic reproduction of the hand? I'm going to conclude now by turning away from the historical evolution and technological engineering of touch interfaces to consider instead their cultural construction. Each of the videos that I've shown here today are not transparent windows onto the operation of haptic interfaces. Rather, they are promotional videos produced by for-profit corporate companies, each attempting to monetize their intellectual property. Haptic interfaces depend on the production of desire for haptic interfaces, on convincing masses of consumers that they need the pleasurable stimulation and epistemic benefits provided by virtualized touch. They situate touch as a lost sensory modality that can be recovered by purchasing high-end consumer electronics devices. Haptic interfaces and their affiliated algorithms of immediate contact are enclosed within the structuring frame of computational capitalism. Their successful proliferation depends on convincing you that you want haptic interfaces. And we are currently in the middle of a new wave of hype around haptic technology, fueled in part by the substantial financial and intellectual investments in haptics as a consequence of the new generation of virtual reality platforms like the HTC Vive and the Oculus Rift. The present spike in interest around stimulating the physicality of virtual environments, driven in part by the impending release of Steven Spielberg's cinematic adaptation of Ernst Cline's Ready Player One, has prompted speculation that we are finally on the verge of definitively realizing a vision of haptics that has long seemed fantastical. And one last quick example here. This headline showed up in my news feed last night as I was completing my talk, right? So, hey, look, Ready Player One technology might be real, right? So this promise to realize the fantastical. And similar claims have been advanced around the haptics virtual reality glove. So the key takeaway from this talk is that while touch does not inherently resist virtualization, the virtualization of touch and its transformation as an epistemic agent depends on its submission to a set of instrumentalizing and machinic logics. Touch can indeed be virtualized. It has already been virtualized, but its virtualization occurs within the structuring frame of industrial capitalism. And just finally, to illustrate this point by way of epilogue, remember that Tesla's suit from the beginning of the video, its 2016 Kickstarter campaign, which offered backers the chance to place pre-orders for the low price of £1,200, was canceled after raising only $35,000 of its target £200,000, demonstrating the challenge that culture as an unwieldy variable poses to the project of virtualizing the haptic senses. Thank you. Speaking of capitalism.
So we have some time for questions.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I think it was really great. 1, 2, 3. I was wondering, because you sorry, I just had to read my notes. They were a bit hard to read. No, but in terms of virtualizing touch, and also with the Tesla suit to wear and really get in touch with the virtual world, considering that there's so many layers of our reality, like with smell, maybe even electromagnetic waves we censor in an unconscious way, whatever. Do you think it could be, in the far future, really possible to kind of create a very similar environment in virtual reality as we have it here in our world? Or in real world?
That's a great question, and I think sort of the challenge for my research is that I think I probably perpetuate a marginalization of other sensory modalities I only look at touch, right? So I don't know about the potential to stimulate smell. I know Mark has written a little bit on that. So I mean, personally, do I think that what they show in these demo videos is realistic? Technically, sure. But in terms of the cultural variable that I highlighted at the end, I don't know. If I knew, I probably would invest a lot of money in that technology and maybe buy an island somewhere. So I think it's a really interesting philosophical question. And I think, more importantly for me, it's a really interesting question that allows us to ask, to push on the relationship between industrial design and capitalism, and that project of disciplining and normalizing the body. So, sorry if that was an inadequate answer to a very good question.
I would just like to also add as well that I think it's quite significant, if I can just take over from your answer, but I think it's quite significant that the Phantom device, which David showed, that was invented at MIT, so it was extremely expensive. So I think it was around $45,000 with kind of freedom of movement, and you could put your fingertip in it, or there was a stylus type thing as well with a degree of freedom. So the promise of that technology was about the very accurate feeling of texture and movement and feedback. So you would actually get the sense of working with material. So actually, as a research device which could be used for computer-aided design and manufacture, but any type of commercial impetus. So it was scaled down and cheapened to just $1,000, and it just didn't sell. And you can't buy them these days. I mean,
It was scaled down to $250 device in the case of the Falcon,
the Falcon,
which was a video game peripheral at $250, and the company folded. They were on the shelves of major corporations. They were in storefronts, Best Buy in the U.S. They were Walmart. Walmart had to stop selling them because they had a gun trigger, and Walmart can sell you a real gun in the U.S., but they can't sell you a toy video game gun attachment because we're sane there.
So I think actually, in terms of the commercial thing, so it's kind of very significant that at the end, the Tesla suit, it doesn't get the capital that it wants to raise, even though actually it's become cheapened as an entertainment device. But it's still maybe still being potentially available, I suppose. But I think it's kind of an interesting thing that maybe we'll have to leapfrog in terms of direct brain stimulation or something. I mean, that's really, in terms of smell as well. Smell is really clunky. I mean, back when 2005, when I wrote about this, there was these kind of printers, so you could assemble a series of smells, and through the combination of them, like printer cartridges, they would then release a smell, and through certain combinations of key smells, you could actually create quite complex smellscapes. But whenever this has worked in cinema, for example, it's very difficult to dissipate that smell, and so on. So, it changes the scene, the film changes the scene, and then the smell still continues, like of the grass, the lawnmower grass, cut grass and everything, rather than the smell of blood and entrails with the following scene or whatever. Yeah, thank you. Any further questions?
Yes, thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you also, in your book, were focusing on the sociological aspect of all this research, in the way that, for example, when you showed the sex toys, it shows that it actually represents a kind of an actual demand from the public, let's say. But if you actually are saying that all of this could happen nowadays, regarding the previous question, like, how do you interpret this? Like, the fact that people could actually just live in a virtual experience of the world, like that maybe they're not interested anymore in the real world experiences, or, I mean, I don't know, just like, why are these people so interested in all this false experience in a way?
Yeah.
And making a hierarchy of, like, between what could be real and false or something?
Yeah, so this is where, so two answers really quickly. This is where I'm so excited by the work that Carrie and her group are doing, because I think that that work gets at that cultural dimension far better than I do in my work, and far better than I'm capable of with the methodologies that I'm trained in. The second answer is sort of a media archaeological answer, which is to say that people have used communication technologies to transport themselves to virtual worlds for a long time, right? So I'm not particularly concerned with that loss of interest in the real world. Like, I'm a gamer, like I'm a really big gamer, when I don't have stuff like this to do. So I'm not a person who's going to sort of condemn that impulse to migrate into the virtual world. I don't sort of draw a hard differentiation between the virtual and the real, right? So my wife is a big reader. If I walk in and interrupt her when she's reading a book, she talks to me like I've committed the worst sin in the world, right? And that is arguably her absorption in an antisocial virtual world. The same way that I get quite annoyed when she interrupts my long gameplay sessions, right? So, the sex toy stuff I think is way more problematic, and we can talk about reasons why it's problematic because it unfolds, in a sort of misogynistic culture of production. So, I'm happy to talk more about that. But just in terms of the suits, things like the Tesla suit, I'm not worried that people want to migrate into virtual worlds.
Thanks.
Yeah, I actually had one more question. That considering that people are already, I'm spinning super science fiction now, but people are already talking about the pollution of the planet, and maybe at some point people are going to live out of space and space stations, whatever. I just had the thought, and I wondered what you say about this, that there might be also the people fleeing into virtual realities as having this as a more sustainable way of living, as you don't need transportation and way less of...
Certainly, this is one of the, way back in the 70s, when they were first researching this technology, that was one of the arguments, all the way back then, was that it would eliminate the need to transport bodies. And this is, I think, an exact quote from Michael Knowles' dissertation in 1970, 71, 72, something like that. Why transport bodies when you can transport signals instead, right? And once the sense of embodiment gets good enough, and by good enough, I mean good enough to be culturally acceptable, the same way that when I speak to my partner later on tonight, her voice will sound good on the phone, good enough to be an acceptable copy. I think that could be one potential benefit of the technology, certainly. And I think that's part of the conceit of the Ready Player One book and film, is that people have migrated into these virtual worlds as an escape from a really sort of tyrannical and awful dystopian real world.
Also Facebook, that's also already happening, especially with Facebook Spaces, which is scary. Okay, yeah. So can you just wait for the, yeah.
It's just a quick question about the Tesla suit and the fact that you could literally, physically die. You said...
No,
maybe I'm understanding it completely
not
incorrectly.
in the Tesla suit. So this is sort of the dream of, I'm sorry about that. This is the dream of Ivan Sutherland in his Ultimate Display essay. And there's a really interesting article that came out in Wired about a month and a half ago that said that the Haptic Glove that I showed you and a couple of other interfaces were inflicting pain on their players. That article that ran in Wired was complete fabrication. And so both with a Haptic Glove and with all these other interfaces, there's a design imperative to keep the users comfortable and to avoid inflicting pain. So the interface, this is an argument that I make in the book, the interface acts as a selective shield that only allows pleasurable sensations to pass through. And what we mean by painful and pleasurable is obviously culturally coded, but...
Right.
The Tesla suit cannot kill you. I don't want to get sued by the Tesla suit people.
Because the thing being, we could talk about virtual realities all we want, but at the end of the day, we need to sleep, we need to eat, and so yeah, basically, I think it's a complicated subject in general. But
yeah, and I would not
pain, pleasure is like...
Yeah, and this is why it's always tricky for me whenever I'm talking about this subject, because I don't want to sound the moral panic bells here, but I'm also not like a booster. I find the technology really interesting, right? I find it allows me to ask questions about things that I'm trained to ask questions about the discipline and normalization of the body and the senses. So I don't stand up here saying, go buy a Tesla suit, right? And I also don't stand up here saying the Tesla suit is going to ruin everything, right? So extra environmental, as McLuhan would have put it.
So maybe no further questions. Thank you. So hands together for David Parisi, please.